Thank you everyone for coming along today. It's just such a pleasure, such an honor to be here again at Mama. So this talk is called The Jalouissance of the Other Woman. How are we to understand the extraordinary images streaming out of Iran in late 2022? Images of women unveiled and unveiling, hair flying freely, burning hijabs offered up like flags on sticks. We see thousands and thousands of women, and almost as many men, bareheaded, chanting the revolutionary slogan, Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. In a remarkable text translated into English as Women Reflected in Their Own History, the author, writing anonymously under the letter L, describes the profound impact these images have had on her. She's fascinated by what she sees on social media. She finds herself galvanized into action. As if propelled by a dislocated, syncopated heartbeat from beyond her body, she leaps into the picture and into the street to be with the women the photographs portray. I want to be that woman, with that figure of resistance, the one I saw the picture of, and I create a figure. In fact, Elle discovers that she has always already been that woman. I was that image. I was coming to my senses and realizing that I am in a ring of women burning headscarves, as if I had always been doing that before. Now, commenting on this text, Alenka Zupancic defines a figure as a body that incorporates structure in a particular kind of way, elaborating that a figure takes the shape of a blind spot in the socioscopic arrangement. A figure absorbs an immanent contradiction in a situation, and by making visible what the state is unable or refuses to see, returns the contradiction in the form of an enigma. In the history of the encounters between the West and the East, the veiled woman was once a figure in this sense, as Joan Kopchak outlines in her classic essay, The Sartorial Superego. Here Kopchak invites us to understand the voluminous enshrouding and enstiffening of the female body in de Clérambault's Moroccan photographs as pointed advertisements to what utilitarianism sought to repress, so a certain excess that has no place in a social and economic order founded on the fabric of felicity of a Benthamite ethics. Literally jutting out of utilitarianism's visual field, the veiled female figure exposes a tactile enjoyment disproportionate to any practical function that the cloth as a covering could serve. Now, in the contemporary Islamic world, as Zupancic sees it, the hijab, at the heart of the women's protests, is being required to perform a double function. It is simultaneously the locus of a societal contradiction and an imaginary resolution of that contradiction. For the hijab, she ventures, serves as a convenient distraction from the politically inconvenient truth that there is actually very little difference between Western and non-Western capitalism. In Zupancic's eyes, the hijab has become a false marker, enlisted to visually register a difference that doesn't really exist. Now, in what follows, I will pursue some threads in L's evocative text, focusing on some questions posed by the veil. This will take us into a discussion of seeing and of mimeticism, and the part these play in the formation of certain kinds of groups, feminine ones. These reflections on L's reflections are then also encircled by Kopchak's perceptive thoughts on visuality and sexual difference, from her already mentioned early work on Clérambault's photographs to Renaissance perspective, to her recent considerations of Iranian cinema. And what will become clear is that despite its couverture, or covering over, Badiou's term for the process by which a glimpsed infinity is diffused and made unrecognizable, The contemporary veil, or hijab, still retains something of its creative infinite power, even if, in the case of the Zhina Uprising, in reverse, as the veil's unveiling. What is most striking in Elle's reaction to seeing the young woman brandishing her burning headscarf is the realization, I was her. I was that image. It seems that to remove the veil is to uncover a likeness of a different order than the sameness that the hijab wants to render upon all women. If the figures in the photographs accompanying Elle's text are largely unrecognizable, no doubt for very good reasons, they're shot from the back or with their faces obscured by COVID masks, this impersonality only enables the hijab's flames to part more broadly upon what Elle, in a footnote, names a face for everyone. As it folds and refolds, the veil is, as Jacques Derrida observes, in a constant movement, perpetually unveiling oneself, reaffirming the veil in unveiling. The veil generates multiple significations that overlap in ever-evolving patterns. This doubled nature of the veil also catches the eye of Badiou. In his book on St. Paul, Badiou observes how Paul enlists the veil to illustrate how the universal is categorically indifferent to sexual difference. Badiou cites Paul's observation that woman's long hair acts as a kind of natural veil. But when this natural veil is superimposed with the artificial sign of the hijab, woman is in a position to confirm symbolically that she is a woman. Inversely, Badiou goes on, a man who walks bareheaded attests to his being a man through the supplementary sign of his short hair. And by means of these two confirmations, one positive and one negative, St. Paul arrives at a universalizing egalitarianism, Badiou maintains, and one that is achieved through the symmetrical, equitable application of an inegalitarian rule. In testifying equally to their differences, men and women thus traverse them. Badiou states that sex becomes indifferent in the universality of the declaration. Well, we can explore things further by putting this into psychoanalytic terms. From the vantage point of psychoanalysis, the veil grants woman entry into the symbolic by acting as an artificial signifier that points to woman's absence of the penis. The veil thus performs as a sort of prosthetic phallus, marking a place in the symbolic for what has no signifier. The veil, as an anti-sign, as Fethi Banslama's phrasing, and whose psychoanalytic insights I'm drawing on here, would stand in for or represent woman's phallic lack. The veil's unconscious, but nonetheless publicly visible message, or publicly legible message, is that women, like men, are castrated. And in Lacan's formulation, the signification of the phallus is indeed nothing other than this fact. From this vantage point, one sees how, by converting woman's lack of the phallic signifier into a prohibition against seeing, the veil establishes itself as a factitious point in the visual field that is a functional equivalent of the vanishing point in Renaissance perspective. The latter's function, Kopjek notes, is to mark the place of the viewing subject. The vanishing point implicitly positions the viewer in the place from which the world as an image is to be viewed. Thus, it is not only women's sartorial obligations under Islam that the Zhina Uprising is aimed at, but an entire system of state-sanctioned seeing. For the veil, as Ben Slama theorizes it, is not only the article of cloth thrown over the body of woman, but the organizing hand of an order that is rigorously laid out between the subject of desire as a seeing subject and the political institution of the city. Well, what is the logic of this organizing hand? In its dual role as the symbol of prohibition and as the visible sign of men's and women's universal castration, the veil at this juncture can be understood as positioned on what Lacan identifies as the masculine side of his formulas of sexuation. One recalls how in his Encore seminar, Lacan orients the positions of men and women around the limit imposed by castration, which is organized differently for the two sexes. Man is limited by an exception in the form of a one who escapes the universal condition of castration, whereas woman is limited by being not wholly or not all castrated. As the governing visual logic of the Iranian street, the masculine formula of sexuation would state that while every man is forbidden to look at women's naked bodies, synecdochically represented by her loose tresses that must accordingly be hidden by the hijab, there is nevertheless a one who sees through everything. And we could put it more strongly still. It seems it is to safeguard the existence of this one that the veil is required. A fine, delicate piece of cloth is all that separates all-seeing God from man. How can this be? In Arabic, the word pupil means the man in the eye. Ben Slana notes that, playing on this, the Andalusian 12th century mystic Ibn Arabi maintained that, quote, man is to God what the pupil is to the eye. As God's organ of sight, man surveys God's creation. Yet his vision must nevertheless halt at a point beyond which only God's eye is permitted to go. One encounters again the veil's intrinsic doubleness, as it points to man's blindness in relation to God, while simultaneously indicating the idea of God's infinite seeing, his ability to penetrate beneath every fold. In the previous discussion, we approached the veil's symbolic function as establishing the universality of castration. But now we discover its additional signification as literally a material reminder to men and to women that there is an exception to this rule. There exists a one whose totalizing vision compensates for the fact that every other man is obliged to literally curtain off his jouissance, to recall a witticism from Kopjak. From this perspective, the larger threat of the Zhina Uprising resides in the way the women's free-flowing hair would put in peril the limit point that separates man from God. Put simply, the unveiled head of the woman threatens the collapse of a theological seeing order, a point that Badiou himself makes when he remarks that woman is always, by herself, the earthly proof that God does not exist, that God does not need to exist. It is enough to look at a woman to be immediately convinced that one can very well do without God, he says. There is yet another dimension to this complex of the veil, however, which Ben Slama invites us to see. A peculiar sort of alter vision that is set in train whenever the veil is worn. For he notes an intriguing detail in the accounts of female analysans who have been forced to wear the veil, where more than one have reported an overwhelming phantasmatic sense of being enveloped by a powerful eye that attaches to and intersects their bodies. Initially, this seems to confirm the above analysis of a one whose gaze penetrates everyone and everywhere. And yet we also learn that in this dialectic of the veil and the eye, the women report feeling that they themselves become entirely this eye that sees without being seen. The veil is, as Ben Slama memorably describes it, an eye veil. So a preternatural image begins to assemble itself at this juncture. To see all as God does produces an effect whose uncanniness lies not in the ordinary uncanny of seeing Medusa's head, the absence of a penis in women's genitalia, but the inordinary, or perhaps supraordinary uncanny experience of seeing the lack itself look back at one, a slit or cut mysteriously transformed into a lidded eye that suddenly blinks open. Is it this eye that the women of the revolution threatened to set ablaze with their torched hijabs? Blind and yet seeing, a sort of double stitch in the representational fabric that absorbs light's trajectory and inhibits vision's logic of sequential or unfolding disclosure. The veil must be carefully supervised, lest man finds himself surrounded by an imminent eye. In the face of this unlimited oculus, God's pupil fights off the sensation of falling backwards into his own black hole. Cannibalizing light, the veil haunts vision as an anamorphotic ghost. It ingests, curves, and folds the inside back out. The phallic signifier is always hidden and veiled, explains Lacan in his seminar on the transference, and yet here, hijab, the very definition of the forbidden, hijacks the phallic order of seeing that man expected it would defend. L's striking sentence, "I want to be that woman with that figure of resistance, the one I saw the picture of, and I create a figure," comes back as a refrain. Earlier with Zupancic, we understood the concept of the figure as a structural body. What is the nature of the structure embodied in the figures of the Zhina Uprising? A number of other commentators have similarly recognized something unique emerging from the Iranian women's protests, including Slavoj Žižek, who was quick to urge the progressive West to learn from the Iranians. For the psychoanalyst Gohar Humayunpour, the protests herald nothing less than the end of a fetishistic, phobic model of desire. In her analysis of the scenes of revolt, Humayunpour revives a figure from Persian mythology. This is the woman Rudabe, who, Rapunzel-like, lets down her hair to allow her lover to climb up to her. And tellingly, in this account, the man chooses to ascend by a rope, not her hair, so as not to hurt her. The son of their union, Rostam, becomes the epic hero of Iran. But can we not see a new epic hero emerging in the figures of these young women, Humayunpour asks? We are observing the birth of Rudabe's daughter. She has let her hair down, and a new epic hero, a feminine epic hero, is being born. One who is showing a sense of creativity, courage, resilience, and most importantly, a hospitality towards cohabitation, which is part and parcel of thinking of the birth and becoming of a thinking subject. Humayunpour continues, an event has happened, and whatever happens now, there will be a before and an after. Rudabai's daughter will transform this land, and I look forward to her becomings. Well, I think one is justified to hear in this comment a reference to Badiou's notion of an event. That is, as something that shatters the underlying ontological constraints of a presented multiplicity. And in Humayunpour's enjoinder that this new female epic hero is one whose name we must find together, we are similarly reminded of Badiou's stipulation that an event must be named before it can become a truth. Now, although to my knowledge Badiou has yet to address the Iranian protests directly, one imagines the uprising would meet many of his criteria for a real experiment in the politics of emancipation. Like the event, the uprising exploded unforeseen, offering itself as a local rupture. Second, the Zhina Uprising established itself as an anti-finitude action, inasmuch as it is centered on the proper name, Masa Zhina Amini. Any emancipatory politics, Badiou writes, or the popular concentrate of its meaning is necessarily a proper name, which he calls a revolutionary works index. What one cannot know, in advance of course, is whether a true political innovation will have emerged from these events, or if they only renew and strengthen the state's existing conservative tendencies. Indeed, Badiou, in one of his 13 Theses, cautions us that one of the symptoms of an absence of true politics is the expectation of change on an absurd timescale, one which is itself drawn from a model of commodities and the circulation of money. If, however, in the logic of the future anterior, the Zhina Uprising in its process of becoming will have been an event, and may also have precipitated a compelling new figure for how a collective body, based on feminine enjoyment, can form. So what I propose is that we must understand the Zhina Uprising's unrelenting focus on the mandatory hijab as more than just a generalized metonymic discontent with the state of affairs, where the hijab comes merely to symbolize all of the people's wider complaints about the existing social and political order of things in the Islamic Republic of Iran, so the lack of economic opportunities for the young, the infringement of human rights, including those of self-expression, etc. For is it not the opposite? Each and every one of these entirely valid reasons for revolt, which are movingly itemized in the iconic song that has become the voice of the revolution, Shervin Hajipur's Baraya, because, only emerge in situ against the backdrop of the key demand of the hijab. The protest against the hijab is therefore remarkable both in its simplicity and its apparent inconsequentiality, its relative insignificance compared with the many other serious affronts captured in Hajipur's protest song, which laments, among others, poverty, pollution, corruption, refugees, the killing of street dogs, unlawful detentions, the drug trade, even the absence of transgender rights in its litany of reasons for why Iranians should fight for Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. But the key demand of the hijab, in fact, envelops all of these others in the Spartacus-like statement that it contains. We women, we want to and can no longer be the strut of vision for the Islamic patriarchal state. We women, we want to and can no longer allow our fragile hair to support the weight of its phallic order. Let us return, however, to my suggestion above, which is that with its unrelenting focus on the veil, the promise of the Zhina Uprising offers to the world another view of how a collective might come to be formed, outside of or in excess to the masculine logic of the exception and the monocular vision by which it herds the infinite to a vanishing point located beyond this world. At the heart of the uprising is what L calls a new desire. What does this desire entail? And how are we to understand its psychic structure? Well, we can make an initial way in by turning to Humayunpur's comment that in the Zhina Uprising we are witnessing the return of the repressed female body. This body, she writes, refuses to be covered symbolically. It says, face the fetishistic, phobic cause of your desire and look at me in my ordinariness, in my hunger for an ethics of women, life and freedom. Here, the implication is that removing the veil dislodges the woman from her seat in the masculine fantasy and enables her to move about freely in the public sphere as simply a female human being. The problem with this, however, as you'll recall from Ben Slama and Derrida, is that the veil always contravenes the movement that we think we are following. Moebius-like, the veil always reaffirms itself in its unveiling. Thus, to imagine that a woman can shed herself of the veil and appear in the symbolic in all of her unagalmic ordinariness is to overlook Badiou's key point, namely that in order to appear in public, to step into the universal dimension, woman needs to be counted, as it were, twice. First, as a woman, and second, as a woman who testifies in a symbolic way to being a woman. And furthermore, Humayunpur's statement seems to overlook a critical point concerning the veil, which is its inherent doubleness, the way it always obtrudes in the representational field in a dual capacity, acting both as a visual lure for netting desire and as an embodiment of the I, a subjectless, objectless void around which the drives turn. In the mode of a knotting in the representational fabric, the veil, in effect, veils two wholes, one of which is of a different order than the simple phallic opposition of presence and absence. So even as I share Humayunpur's impression that with the Zhina Uprising, we are witnessing a radically disruptive event, not only in Iran, but more broadly in a dominant mode of seeing of both East and West, I hesitate over Humayunpur's conclusion. As Freud discovered, somewhat to his chagrin, repression does not vanish once an unconscious wish has been expressed. And to understand more clearly what is at stake will require us to turn to what Freud says about the unconscious structure of group formation. Now, the peculiar feature of groups is their unusual propensity to enable the individual to shed his or her identities and to become part of a larger entity, a tendency very contrary to one's nature, Freud suggests wryly, and which is possible only under certain circumstances. Freud explains these as the individual experiencing conditions which allow him to throw off the repressions of his unconscious instinctual impulses. Groups behave in unpredictable and unrestrained ways. Experiencing a loss of impulse control, profoundly suggestible, people in groups perform actions they would never dream of doing as individuals, readily sacrificing, as Freud puts it, their personal interest to the collective interest. This giving of oneself over to a group identity is typically accompanied with a euphoric feeling like that of being in love. Indeed, the group's euphoria corresponds to love instincts which have been diverted from their original aims, Freud explains. Now, Freud's analysis of group behavior draws on his speculations in Totem and Taboo concerning a certain prehistory of the organization of human society, which he hypothesizes to have been dominated in its earliest forms by a powerful male figure. He names this social organization the primal horde, and he discovers unconscious traces of this structure in contemporary group behaviors. And this is a longish quote from Freud. The psychology of such a group, as we know it from the descriptions to which we have so often referred, so the dwindling of the conscious individual personality, the focusing of thoughts and feelings into a common direction, the predominance of the affective side of the mind and of unconscious psychical life, the tendency to the immediate carrying out of intentions as they emerge, all this corresponds to a state of regression to a primitive mental activity of just such a sort as we should be inclined to ascribe to the primal horde. The modern group would be an archaic memory of an older social structure, the primal father resurfacing in the present in the shape of the modern group ideal, Freud explains. So the leader of the group is still the dreaded primal father. The group still wishes to be governed by unrestricted force. It has an extreme passion for authority. In Le Bon's phrase, it has a thirst for obedience. The primal father is the group ideal which governs the ego in the place of the ego ideal. From our perspective, the important connection between the ancient horde and the modern group is this common feature of a figure outside the group, whose external position is the key mechanism that binds the group together. In a two-step move, individuals are incited to relinquish their own ego ideal, which gets substituted with the group ideal, the fascinating, hypnotic figure of their leader, while egoically identifying with the others on the horizontal plane. So even from this brief description, it's clear that this model of the group does not adequately account for the experiences that Elle portrays in Women Reflected in Their Own History. When Elle discovers that she is the woman whose image she sees, when a ring of women dancing around a burning headscarf suddenly metastasizes across the country into ever more explosive circles, we seem to be encountering another model of group formation. Instead of a libidinal attachment to an external leader, we find a propagation of collective figures without it being clear where they came from, as Elle expresses it. How are we to account for this other model? In group psychology, Freud devotes a section of his essay to the phenomenon of identification, which he calls the very first emotional tie of the infant. A child may identify with a beloved figure, or may wish to supplant that figure in relation to another loved object. In both cases, Freud explains, whether the tie attaches to the subject or to the object of the ego, identification involves an object relation. But he also points to a third form of identification that takes us on a different path. And intriguingly for us, Freud's example of this third model is a group of young women or girls. The scene Freud paints is of a boarding school where one of the girls receives a letter from a person she is secretly in love with. Something in the letter sets off an hysterical reaction in the girl, which is then caught by all the other girls. This is from Freud. Some of her friends who know about it will contract the fit, as we say, by means of mental infection. Now, Freud is careful to specify that what is at stake in these cascading waves of hysteria is not an identification with the girl who received the letter. Rather, what binds them together is what he calls their openness to a similar emotion, which Kopchak glosses as a sense of belonging to an indeterminate totality. The girl's identification occurs by way of analogy with the other's capacity to feel, and is therefore quite different to the two previously discussed forms of identification. As I indicated, the crucial difference is that this third form of identification does not involve an object relation with the one being imitated. What the girls identify with is rather a shared emotional complexity, an affective propensity that is expressed in the very form of the affective response that it elicits. Freud explains, the other girls would like to have a secret love affair too, and under the influence of a sense of guilt, they also accept the suffering involved in it. Well, what is this suffering? Although Freud does not elaborate, it seems plausible the letter contained a reference to someone else, leading the girl to suspect that she has a rival, with the concurrent implication that she is not loved, or at least not exclusively. Like an uncontainable fit of the giggles, the girl's initial hysterics catalyze a general mental infection, each girl receiving and transmitting simultaneously, all reinforcing the others, so it is no longer possible to distinguish who is copying whom. Unlike hypnotic groups, whose identificatory structure revolves around an external or exceptional figure of enjoyment, in the situation of what we might name the jealous group, we discover an internal figure, an other or others, who is or are enjoying in my place, or better, in the place where I believe myself to be. This other, who has always already ejected me from my supposed place, from my home in my body, is nearer to me than any specular other who might offer themselves as an object of identification. Moreover, this irrepressibly contagious mimetic relation with the internal other does not reflect a one that I want to be like, nor a one whose place I wish to usurp, but instead ignites a radical desire in me to enjoy her enjoy being in me. So a kind of a pun, enjoy and envy, or jalouissance. This is from Lacan. So to call this enjoy the jalouissance of the other woman is to invoke a term that, in combining both jealousy and enjoyment, shunts us to another, even earlier emotional tie than identification, to what Lacan, in his Encore seminar, calls the first substitute jouissance. Lacan is commenting on the famous passage in St. Augustine, where the author of the Confessions recounts how I myself have seen jealousy in a baby and know what it means. He was not old enough to talk, but whenever he saw his foster brother at the breast, he would grow pale with envy. Enkindled by the image of another child at the mother's breast, Jalouissance is said to sprimage forth in Bruce Fink's creative translation for Lacan's neologism, s'imaginer, which combines these two ideas of springing forth, jaillisse, and imaging, s'image, the latter's significance that we will address shortly. For the moment, however, we can observe how Jalouissance summons an unusual mode of identification that Lacan alludes to in his Ethics seminar, where he describes a special form of jealousy. Lacan refers to a Lebensneid that is not an ordinary form of jealousy, since it concerns nothing that the subject can know or experience for itself. Lebensneid involves the envy of an enjoyment that is accessible only to the one who is enjoying. Lacan writes, it is an envy of this other who is held to enjoy a certain form of jouissance or superabundant vitality that the subject perceives as something that he cannot apprehend by means of even the most elementary of affective movements. And the critical point is that this envy, too, produces an identification. But with what? Not with the other, but in a virtual way, as Lacan puts it, with a concept. Paradoxically, in their hysterical fits, the girls identify with something that none of them can ever know or experience themselves. In the hypnotic group, enjoyment is relegated to a single figure, the leader, who stands outside the others who have sacrificed their self-interest on the condition, that everyone else do the same. In the jealous group, however, we seem to encounter the inverse. Transmitted through a mimetic performance is an enjoyment had by all, but had only indirectly via an analogy. Analogy with what? Analogy with the other woman, with a capital O, who, in Lacan's formulation, famously insists. And this is a word that perhaps contains the stirrings of a new political sorority, an insisterhood. This famous insistence in the psyches of the girls as an only ever imagined enjoyment. For in what other way are we to understand the unconscious message of the girls' hysterics, their uncontrollable convulsions, if not as the orgasmic spasms of this other woman passing from girl to girl? Excuse me. My own hysterical fit. Fundamentally unknown to the subject, yet inhabiting the nearest reaches of one's being. The Jalouissance of the other woman would pre- and post-date the dialectic of desire. For we must be careful to note that this Jalouissance is not founded on the phallic cut, but precedes it as a circulation of affective substitutions, these Augustinian jealousies. And what is curious is the way Jalouissance is transmitted through the visual sense, suggesting that jealousies predate language even as they traverse the body along tropological pathways, here along the trope of analogy. Perhaps it is an image of a concept rather than a concept proper which necessarily bestows existence upon an object that we should approach Jalouissance, a concept image whose peculiarly indirect presentation offers up to some kind of view the not identical to itself of the void in Badiou's schema, an indirect presentation of pre-numerosity, or what Badiou, in his indelible phrase, describes as the swarming coextensive with being. From this perspective, Jalouissance would impose a concept without an identity, if such a thing is possible, or even thinkable. A concept that does not subsume an object beneath it. This non-conceptualizable concept image, openness to emotion, predates the count as one. Commenting on the jealous nature of women's love, Colette Soler explains that jealousy demands being. In fact, it does more, she clarifies. In its moments of reciprocal plenitude, a woman's jealous love succeeds in producing, as a temporary effacement of the effect of lack in being, a transitory corrective to castration. The other jouissance, for this is clearly what is at issue, would overturn the specular model of identification. It spills over the structure of the phenomena regulated by language, which is another way of saying phenomena structured by the phallic cut. It spills over phenomena that are structured by the phallic cut. Turning back now to L's luminous text, we find the author venturing a suggestive metaphor for the actions on the street. In patterns of decentralized nodes that erupt spontaneously, appearing in unpredictable surges at unexpected locations, the protests L names situations suggest the multiple erotic stimulation points of feminine enjoyment. Closely allied with Debord's notion of situation as a collective ambience, L's use of the term seems intended to do more than what it signifies in Badiou, where the situation refers to a structured presentation whose operator is the count as one. Debord describes a situation as, quote, the concrete construction of momentary ambiences of life and their transformation into a superior, passional quality. And yet he views a situation as a systematic intervention which, in being collectively prepared and developed, still assumes the requirement for one individual to play a sort of director role, he says. For L, by contrast, the situation emerges unrehearsed, each participant an erotic node stimulating the next woman to create a figure in the next link of the chain. In this respect, situations would possess different revolutionary capacities to those of mass democratic protest. The strategies of traditional street protest can be understood as strategies for Euclidean space, where the protesters form a dense mass of unidirectional movement whose aim is to shut down or clog the state's normal operations. A situation, by contrast, exploits a hidden openness in seemingly closed spaces. Single-point perspective, a viewpoint predicated on the deserted street, yields in the situation to neighbourhoods, to locales, to envelopes, and to the subsequent remodelings of the thinking of place and of the multiple that such sites where being intrudes imply. And these are some of the intriguing mathematical inflections of space and groups that's treated by hating algebra or algebraic topology. Under the latter's distributive conditions, the logic of the single viewing subject becomes re-envisaged as a group formation where viewer and viewed perfectly commingle in the same space or field of perception, disjoint yet homeomorphic. What I saw was very similar to what I had watched before, but there was a gap between my watching self and myself on the street, and I needed a few moments to register it. Here Elle draws attention to the unique temporality she experiences in her perceptions of the uprising. Elle points to an absence in time, an infratemporal interval in which transformation occurs. A break in time's continuum, this revolutionary interval, corresponds to the photograph in Elle's explanation. She writes, "The women's uprising in Iran is a photocentric one." Rather than the linear temporal continuum of video, this is from Elle again, expressing and representing the situation of confrontation, action, or repression, the history of this body is crystallized in a moment, in a revolutionary moment. Pausing on the moment when the woman is raising the torch and making a victory sign, the movement of the eyes across the frame, the shimmering light of the car behind, the raised arms, the profile of the man standing by, the trees on the street, the figure, pause. The figure is created in a historical syncope, in a pause, rather than a chronological continuum, where the heart of history stops for a moment. I seem to be missing one of my slides. In the photograph, the image is transformed into a figure upon which history, as the sequential unfolding of time and events, freezes. The photograph iconicizes the revolt. It permits a singular body to crystallize a unique moment out of time, to carry the idea in isolation without reference to the moment before or after. So one could venture that the photo graphs what mathematicians call the real line connecting the stack of neighborhoods in topological space. So it maps the homeomorphic relations among the revolutionary bodies. Transmitted nearly instantaneously via the cell phone, the photograph becomes the technological vector for the other jouissance, the medium for a jalouissance that deforms the structure of the ego and its identifications and transforms the women into operational figures circling around the burning veil. And this understanding of the photograph thus seems very different from that of Walter Benjamin in his account of the work of art in an age of mechanical reproduction, where the photographic image is associated with the decay of aura, the latter famously defined as that strange weave of space and time, the unique appearance or semblance of distance, no matter how close it may be. And certain comments of Badiou's regarding the selfie as the visual equivalent of what he's calling de-absolutized politics suggest that he would concur with Benjamin on this. For in order for a finite image to be active, he claims, there must be this aspect of work, the work that he finds, say, in Rembrandt's self-portraits. The latter, he says, make you feel their implicit infinity immediately, but as a result of the hard work, the work that Rembrandt has put into the painting. What becomes apparent is that the photographs of the Zhina Uprising also demand work. But this work has to take place on the side of the viewer. And in this sense, they are inheritors of Eugene Atget, whose photographs Benjamin extols as exemplars of de-auratic art. Atgert's photographs of Paris are predominantly of emptiness, Benjamin observes. The city in these pictures looks cleared out, like a lodging that has not yet found a new tenant. Atgert's signature is of a perception whose sense for the sameness of things has grown to the point where even the singular, the unique, is divested of its uniqueness. This is what Benjamin intriguingly calls the politically educated eye, under whose gaze all intimacies are sacrificed to the illumination of detail. As we noted earlier, the photos of the Zhina Uprising are similarly devoid of individuality. Elle observes a contrast between face-centric and message-centric images of protest and the facelessness of the figure, which she frames in terms of, quote, the transition from a person who talks about herself and her demands to a silent and steady figure, the figure of resistance. It is a desire to become that figure, the work Elle calls interpretation, that the photograph's political education effectuates. And what this also suggests is that when Elle and her sisters see themselves reflected in their own history, it is as if a veil has been lifted on a representational paradigm that dictated a minimal distance for the viewing subject. Famously, in the story of Zeuxis and Parrhasius, it is the painting of the curtain or veil that wins the competition, the prize going not to the closest approximation of reality that fools even the birds, but to the illusion that Parrhasius's painted veil produces that makes one think there is something hidden behind it. It is out of this hiddenness, from the supposition of distance the veil manifests, which is also the enigma of the Atgert photographs in Benjamin's account, that the figure as concept image arises as a kind of circulating aura without an object, indeed as what predates the carving up of the world into objects. A distance without a foreground, a view that presupposes no viewing subject, a bloße Anschauung in Kant's sense in his third critique. Can we think of this mobilizing hiddenness as the positivization of the other woman's impossible nearness to us, our inner distance, as Kopchak describes it, that is responsible for the fact that one is not in one's body, but, as she puts it, alongside it? In the infinite loopings of image and figure that Elle identifies in the dialectic of the photograph and the street, the other woman's jouissance acquires some sort of body. And what this also implies is an important ongoing role for mimetic or reflective models, as the title of Elle's text makes clear, although this will require another approach to mimesis, not as imitation or copy of an original, but perhaps something like the impression of a phosphene, a palpebral pressure on the inner eyelid, a perception absented from light. A mimeticism without an original, producing a short-circuited reflection that reflects only itself. These are some of the intriguing ideas that Elle's title seems to call forth in her phrase, women reflected in their own history. So to close this discussion, we might regard phosphenic perception as the feminine obverse of the mysterious eye veil that hijab-wearing women described to Ben Slama. Previously, we understood this eye as an artifact of masculine sexuation, the imaginative substrate of an uncanny gaze set loose by castration that soaks up the nothing beyond appearance. The phosphene suggests an artifact of feminine jouissance, invoking what Lacan suggests as a pre-identificatory mode of seeing, a sort of pre-image of the subject, to enlist an analogy with mathematics, where this term refers to the shape of a figure before it is transformed into an image. It is striking that just following his discussion of Augustinian envy in Seminar 11, Lacan should evoke the idea of a dance where the dancers pause in just such a frozen attitude as L extols in the photographic figure. And the purpose of the dancer's gesture, Lacan indicates, is to ward off the evil eye. Inhabiting a very special temporality, these static, gestural figures strip the gaze of its mortification. They dispossess it of its malevolent anti-life and anti-movement power. Here Lacan emphasizes what he calls the total distinction between the scopic register and the invocatory, vocatory, vocational field of the gesture. Like a figure who gives birth to herself, or a reflection that in reflecting reflects only itself, the invocatory, vocatory gesture intervenes in an imperceptible infra-interval between the moment of seeing and the moment of concluding, in an unpresentable time for comprehending when the subject is essentially indeterminate. Badiou has expressed his utmost faith in women. What I'm sure of, he says, without quite knowing why, is that they will invent a new young woman. This nouvelle jeune fille, he claims, will conceive another relation to the totality, not as a negative relation, the not all, but by thwarting the one insofar as it is not. For this is how Badiou conceives of his difference from Lacan. For Badiou, woman is a process rather than a position, recalling woman's unique affinity with the inherent duplicity of the veil, understood this time not as the limit separating man from God, but as an archistructural division in the representational field, a concept I take from Ben Slama, who builds it out from the other meaning of jealousy, from the Italian gelosia, a blind or trellis. An ongoing process of partitioning and transforming the field of the visible. Woman splits the one, not between an inside and a transcendental outside, but into multiple fretted structures, neighborhoods of disjoint sets, connected homeomorphically through the reel of feminine Jalouissance. Should it surprise us, then, that topology bestows the name covering space to a map of this kind of structure? A covering space is completely different from couverture. Thank you very much.